If there's one thing our society loves, it's superhero movies. Or they hate them. Or they're okay with them. Honestly, Twitter is just full of people yelling at each other, so it's a bit hard to get a grasp on what exactly people do and don't like. But if there was ever a time the general public still wasn't fully on board with the whole superhero idea, it was 2000 to 2011. See, in this time period, while the superhero boom most definitely started due to the popularity of film series like X-Men, Spider-Man, and the beginnings of the Dark Knight trilogy, there was still a lot of stinkers that continued to push this idea that comic book movies weren't meant to be taken seriously. Now, they become a dominant force in cinemas and on your televisions. While the market of these kinds of films is mainly dominated by Marvel and DC, there was a time when studios weren't fully sure what could be the next franchise series, which is how we end up with films like The Green Hornet. The Green Hornet was released in early 2011 and starred, of all people, Seth Rogen as the titular hero, along with Jay Chow, Cameron Diaz, David Harbour, and Christoph Waltz. Now, who was the Green Hornet, you may ask? I honestly couldn't tell you. The character went on to appear in multiple film serials and comics until the most famous iteration of the character at the time was in the 1960s show, which starred Bruce Lee as his sidekick, Kato. Now, the idea of a superhero that poses as a villain to infiltrate the criminal underworld is honestly a pretty neat idea. So often we've gotten characters that are either just straight up heroes or anti-heroes. But to have one posing as a criminal is pretty cool, not gonna lie. I'm honestly surprised it isn't done more. The problem is, at the time and even now, this character has had no relevancy in popular culture for several decades. Sure, comics were still being published, even a run written by Kevin Smith based off a screenplay for a film he was going to make at one time, but if you run up to anyone on the street asking who the Green Hornet is, they'll probably ask why you messed up Green Lantern's name. Also, the fact 2011 gave us two superhero films, both starring actors mainly known for comedies, both with green in their name, and both being mediocre movies, is a really weird coincidence. This came out a year before the Avengers, so the Avengers effect, as I like to call it, on the landscape of action films going forward, hadn't taken effect yet. What I mean by that is a more lighthearted, self-aware approach to telling these big, bombastic stories. Sure, this may be a comedy, but it still takes itself seriously and you do see the stakes at play. You also get a lot of humor that would not fly today. So, strangely, this film does feel unique amongst all the comic book movies that came out after it, but it also feels really insignificant amongst them. See, Seth Rogen, who stars in and co-wrote this film with his writing partner Evan Goldberg, was initially excited to be starring in a film of this magnitude. Up until this point, he'd done pretty small comedic and romantic comedies, but had achieved insane success with films like Superbad, Knocked Up, and The Pineapple Express. So, for Sony to want to capitalize on that success with him in a big action film wasn't a terrible idea. The problem is, they kept him on a leash with a PG-13 rating. Yes, PG-13. See, unless it was a kids movie like Monsters vs. Aliens, Seth Rogen primarily made R-rated movies. With an R rating, he and Evan were more free to express themselves in ways they can't with a PG-13 rating. Superbad stands out amongst the landscape of teen sex comedies because of how lewd and crude it can be. Having no restrictions can allow the filmmakers to feel less constrained and can create something that otherwise couldn't be possible. Rogen said that the studio wouldn't go for them making it rated R because of its massive $120 million budget, which is an insane amount of money to throw at a character that hasn't been popular since the 60s. Which is such a weird thing for Sony to have done, given that in 2010, Matthew Vaughn's raunchy R-rated comic book movie Kick-Ass, which was made on a budget of $30 million, was able to bring in over double its budget back. The Green Hornet, when all was said and done, wasn't even able to make back its budget when you factor in marketing costs and other post-production costs. I know Sony at the time was pressed for a big comic book franchise to get started again after not making a Spider-Man movie since 2007, but a PG-13 Seth Rogen movie based on a character from the 60s that wasn't a Marvel or DC character was certainly a choice. I'm not saying this being rated R would have brought in a ton of money, but it would have allowed for the film to feel far more unique and distinct amongst the landscape of comic book movies at the time. And if you look today, Seth Rogen is one of the best adapters of comic book properties. With series like Preacher, Invincible, and The Boys, Rogen has been able to get creators, writers, and directors with unique voices making comic book material that's unlike anything we've gotten for the past several years, most of them being heavily R-rated. Funny how time works. Also, fun fact, this movie comes to us from the director of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Just thought I would mention that. So, what's this movie's deal? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it a movie? Well, let's break it down a bit. Right out the gate, we get Tim Robbins in a bad wig, yelling at a child and tearing off a toy's head. I think this is how all movies should start. We flash forward 20 years and meet our villain, Chudnovsky, played by Christoph Waltz. And yes, this movie will tell you many times his name is Chudnovsky. Mr. Novsky meets up with James Franco, as all villains do, tells him he owns this town. Mr. Franco tries to tell him off in a weird New Yorkish accent despite this being set in LA.
My name's Danny Clear. I deal crystal meth. People call me Crystal Clear. It's easy.
Seriously, dude, why? Franco says Mr. Novsky isn't scary, so he kills his men with a double-barrel handgun. And I just have to say, what's the practicality of that thing? We see later he can move the barrels apart farther, but he never uses it that way until near the end. So, at that point, who are you showing off for? Mr. Franco? Because you just blow him up, you don't even kill him with it. Oh, and side note, a great double feature for James Franco haters is this, and this is the end, because they both kill him off. Just thought I'd mention that. Now, despite the scene being just awkward, Christoph Waltz is clearly having a blast. He's playing this psychotic drug lord that's also really insecure about how he presents himself and how others see him.
My gun has 2 barrels. That's not boring. And it was very difficult to make.
That's exactly what I was talking about. I'm not as scary as some idiot in a green mask. Come on!
It's honestly really refreshing and gave me the most laughs throughout the film. The problem is, he's barely in the movie and his motivation of run LA's crime world is just so boring. Then we see Seth Rogen where a typical Seth Rogen would be, throwing fridges out windows. I don't know, I've never actually seen a Seth Rogen in the wild, so I don't know how they act. We then get this weird sped up footage moment of him making out with some girl in a lot of cars, and I don't know if it's supposed to be funny. All I know is, I don't like it. So, Daddy says he's a waste of space, he's a slacker, I don't know, just throw in the typical dad doesn't love you enough dialogue you get from early 2000s comedies. Then, Daddy dies from a bee sting. While I wish this was a comedic moment because there's been so few genuine ones so far, my wish was not granted. So, Seth Rogen becomes the head of his father's newspaper company and discovers that Kato, the guy that makes his dad's coffee and works on his cars, is also basically Tony Stark if he knew how to fight. And this is where the idea of the Green Hornet becomes interesting. While I'm not too familiar with the original version of the character, it seems like Rogen and Goldberg wanted to make this version a satire of Batman. Rather than be one guy that's super smart and the world's best fighter, you've got the muscle and then the guy with the wallet. Plus, Rogen is a normal looking guy. No chiseled jawline or 8-pack abs, he's just a guy. So often in comic book movies, every hero has to be this chiseled god among men with a shirtless scene, and Marvel will even take comedic actors like Paul Rudd and Chris Pratt and turn them into 6-pack hunks. But here, Rogen is just a guy, and it's honestly refreshing. Having the characteristics of Batman not only be split between 2 people, but also making him a normal person is a really fun idea and is one of my favorite aspects of the movie. So, after bonding over their hatred of his dad, Rogen and Kato decide to go cut off the head of his statue, until they notice people getting mugged. And this is where we get our first action scene, and it's... oh yeah, it's a 3D movie. If y'all remember, in my Harold and Kumar 3D Christmas video, I briefly talked about how after Avatar, studios were really pushing for every movie to have 3D in it, whether it made sense or not. So, for a movie like this to be in 3D, it honestly doesn't surprise me. The problem is, when you do shit like this, watching it in 2D, it becomes very distracting. I saw this in theaters in 3D when it came out, and I thought it was really cool. But now, watching it on a regular TV, it is anything but. However, that being said, these are some pretty unique and interesting fight scenes. It's a pretty cool update to the speed up and slow down techniques that filmmakers like Zack Snyder made popular with films like 300. Having Kato move so fast that he's able to assess any threats and then take them down so swiftly is pretty fun. In the current landscape of comic book and action films, I've got to give props to this film for doing something unique and original to how it approached its action. After beating up the thugs, Rogen gets the idea that they can help people, and instead of doing it how every hero in comics does, they're going to appear to be criminals to infiltrate the criminal underworld. Now, while on paper this idea is really cool, in practice, it's confused at what it wants to do. When I hear an idea like that, I more so imagine them going to the bad guys to work with them and then betray them in some manner. Instead, they just drive around beating up thugs and burning down meth labs. In terms of infiltrating, I think they need to work on their stealth a bit. Oh, also, Cameron Diaz is in this movie, and I don't know why. Cameron Diaz can be a very charming and charismatic actor when given the right role. Here, there's just nothing to her character, and that isn't her fault. Her character's presence here is basically to give Rogan and Kato info on where bad guys are and to cause a rift between Rogan and Kato because they both like her. Yes, even though this is a comic book movie, there is, for some reason, a high school romance love triangle subplot here. Why? Because the film thinks for some reason we need a third act breakup. Now, I'll give Rogan and Goldberg the benefit of the doubt on this one. In terms of comic book movies that have a hero and sidekick, the only major ones were Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Again, I think writing them with this petty romantic rivalry was another idea they were satirizing and making fun of, but it doesn't really come across in that way. I think if this film got a director that understood that satirization they were going for, then I think this would have been a pretty funny idea, because Cameron Diaz doesn't end up with either of them at the end. It subverts the idea of the hero having a romance with someone and is pretty refreshing. This film does have some bright spots. The problem is, it's covered in this murky 3D water that Sony keeps trying to paddle it through, all while Rogan is trying to drown himself in it. Wow, that got pretty dark there. Maybe I shouldn't be writing these so late at night. Anyways, Rogan begins printing a bunch of stories about the Green Hornet to cause up some buzz in the crime world. Mr. Nofsky continues to be insecure about his looks, and fun montages occur. At this point in the movie, it's certainly not great, but I think its different approach and satirization works fairly decently. Then, we hit the halfway mark, and that's when things begin to go downhill. Rogan gets jealous that Kato is wooing Cameron Diaz despite not sexually harassing her. Seriously, Kato, it's 2011. Be more like Rogan's character and sexually harass her at every turn. It always works out for these characters in the end.
Oh my God!
As the tension of two 30-year-olds acting like 15-year-olds that are both in love with the same girl rises, Rogan gets an email from Mr. Nofsky asking for a meeting. And this is the shit that you just don't see in comic book movies anymore. Is it stupid? Yes. Does it make me smile with its stupidity? Of course it does. So, surprise, surprise, the meeting was a setup. That's like thinking you won't be on the toilet for 3 hours after eating at Burger King and you're still shocked when it happens. Like, seriously, dude, how did you not see this coming? And keeping up with our wonderful comic book bullshit, after they're buried alive, how do they get out of this? By blowing themselves up, of course! No, they miraculously survive, because who else but Rogan is going to give us such staggering performances in works like Sausage Party, and they make their escape. And, of course, naturally after having survived a near-death experience, what do our heroes do? Bitch about how both suck and fight like man-children. I mean, Rogan is a man-child in this movie. It still doesn't make it fun to watch. Okay, that's pretty funny. Our heroes go their separate ways because we're applying Netflix rom-com plot outlines to our comic book movies now, and Rogan fires Diaz because I don't even know. We then cut to our wonderful Mr. Nofsky as he plans to kill the Green Hornet, and I actually really love this part. We see this chain of criminals going from person to person to give out a bounty for the head of the Green Hornet, and we see what each person does and who they interact with all at once in this comic book panel style. It's a really cool way to convey this information to us, and is so rarely done in any comic book movie or show. Again, there's flakes of good and unique stuff here, but again, why here? After multiple people are being killed just for wearing green, Rogan has a meeting with District Attorney Chief Hopper to figure out what to do since, yeah, it's kind of his fault random people are being targeted. Hopper suggests that he can help him if he does something for him, that being only reporting on stuff that he wants, which is illegal. Hopper, why? Rogan then realizes, maybe something hinky is going on. As he begins digging deeper, Mr. Nofsky reveals he's going to go by Blood Nofsky because... just because. Look man, you had me on your side by being insecure, that's literally me every day, but even I have the common sense to know that Blood Nofsky isn't going to get me laid any day of the week. After killing off Mr. Henchman, Rogan goes back to hire Cameron Diaz because he realizes she's the only smart person in this movie, not before sexually harassing her one more time for good measure. See, now I'm starting to understand why it's bad to watch any movie pre-2023. Kato then gets an email from Mr. Nofsky, because life is funny, and he wants him to kill Rogan at the same restaurant that Rogan is going to meet Hopper at. Oh yeah, Shit's getting real in this early 2000s high school rom-com. At the meeting, Rogen records Hopper saying out loud all this insanely incriminating stuff and like, dude, you were more subtle in the enclosed office with no one around than you are in the open space with dozens of people. I'm not saying you're bad at your job. I'm just saying you're a moron. Kato shows up, punches a guy through a window, and you know what? I'm not going to get mad, because what would I gain from that at this point? Rogen then puts together that Hopper was working for the bad guys all along, and he forced his dad to not print the crime stuff, but when his dad fought back, he killed him.
What a twist!
I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just saying that seeing this done for the 50th time isn't as shocking as they want us to believe. Rogen apologizes to Kato, the two reunite, and the chase is on. And here, you can see where most of the money went to with this movie. Remember when I said this cost $120 million? Well, you don't really see that money until the third act climactic action scene. Most of the film has been set in one mansion, an office building, and the streets of LA. Any action scene is comparable to the action of the first John Wick, a movie made for a fraction of this one. Look, I'm not saying Seth Rogen is a money launderer, I'm just saying that big cartoony bags of money go missing every day. So, things get blown up, people get shot, and it's honestly a really fun climax. There's a door that has guns on it, Kato hits people with nunchucks, it's just a ball. They arrive at the newspaper office so Rogen can post his conversation to the internet, and man, does this movie make me feel old by saying that. You never really think about how plots like this wouldn't happen this way anymore due to cell phones. Just fun things to think about. Anyway, everyone is really bad at shooting Seth Rogen. Kato does this with the car, and they drive up the elevator to the top floor. Now, I can't really explain it, but seeing a half-torn car driving through an office building is honestly not as funny as I thought it would be. Rogen tries to upload the drive while Kato does all the fighting, and then he sees he didn't actually record anything. Look, I get that Rogen's character isn't the brightest apple, but forgetting to hit that big red record button before the most important meeting of your life is a bit too stupid if you ask me. Mr. Nofsky's about to kill Kato, and Rogen finally obtains the ability to do Kato's slow down fast forward fighting. I'm not even going to bother asking how, because I get to see Mr. Nofsky stabbed in the eyes with 2 planks of wood. I'll give this film some credit, they did their damnedest to get this as close to an R rating as possible. The cops show up, shoot Rogen, they ram Hopper out the window, and they fly away. Now, how they park those ejector seats, I have no goddamn idea. They make their way to Diaz's house where they reveal their secret to her. Diaz reveals she doesn't like either of them and comes up with a clever way to get Rogen to the hospital without drawing attention. By killing him. No, Kato just shoots a blank at him to make it look like he was shot, and he goes to the hospital, and the film just kind of ends. Yeah, if there's any kind of major critique I can give to this movie aside from its bad humor and strange tone, is its story. The film starts out fairly standard, but once Rogen and Kato start fighting crime, it becomes a mess. Their goal throughout the whole film is just to fight crime. They don't really know anything about Jodorowsky, they don't have any ties to him, and the reveal about Hopper comes far too late in the story for it to properly motivate anything. At the end, Rogen and Kato don't swear to fix what Hopper and Jodorowsky did to the city, they basically just go about living their lives. Nothing feels earned at the end. Sure, the bad guys are dead, but nothing feels like it was accomplished in this movie. Rogen is still the same character at the end, there's no big romance that comes together at the end, the film just kind of stops. After watching this again after not having seen it for so many years, I can understand why Rogen says making it was a hellish experience. Everything from Rogen to the director to the script just feels like it's out of their depth. While the film can boast some interesting ideas with how it approaches its hero and the way fight scenes are filmed, the good ideas are too few and far between in a film that was forced to stay too safe for its own good. I honestly think this film would have benefited from having an R rating, because at least then it would have allowed for Rogen and Goldberg to not just go all the way with their ideas and humor, but to truly allow them to satirize comic book tropes and characters in ways that hadn't been done up to that point. I'm very happy that Rogen and Goldberg have gone on to help create some of the best comic book adaptations in recent years, because you can see their frustrations with the limitations here. These two are really talented, and I'm happy their love of comics has gotten a chance to shine for the past several years. I honestly do miss these kinds of comic book movies though. While they're not really that good, you can't deny that they feel like a comic book movie, whether it be through its goofiness, absurdity, or its style. I feel like the only comic book movies these days to embrace the style and love of comic books is the Spider-Verse series. Other than that, comic book movies just all feel the same. I'm not saying I hate the modern comic book movies, I truly love them. The fact we've gotten so many of such a high quality for the past several years is amazing, and the fact that it's so mainstream is really cool to see. but they just don't have what movies like the Green Hornet has, for better or worse. If you haven't seen this one, I don't blame you. But I honestly think you should check it out if you want to see the trend of where casting a comedic actor as a superhero got start, at the very least. It's not the greatest comic book movie, but it definitely isn't the worst. It definitely is a movie.